This is a Sports Catastrophe production. Hey there, Heather Ho, there's Jeff Cutter and welcome you to another Sports Catastrophe on this day. And on this day, February 7, 2016, Super Bowl 50 happened. It was the golden anniversary of the Super Bowl. And a lot of people probably were hoping that it would be played in Los Angeles. I mean, after all, that's where the first Super Bowl was. It was in California, but it was at Levi Stadium in Santa Clara, home to the San Francisco 49ers. So Super Bowl L became Super Bowl 50. And not in the Roman numerals, but the Arabic numerals. So anyway, it took place between the two number one seeds in the AFC. From the AFC, the Denver Broncos, and from the NFC, the Carolina Panthers. Carolina finished at 15-1 and had MVP Cam Newton. And it looked like Carolina was going to be just like almost every 15-1 team in history, winning the Super Bowl. When they made the Super Bowl, they would win it. No 15-1 team had actually lost a Super Bowl when they qualified for it. Now, to clarify, of course, you'll be thinking the 98 Vikings and the 2011 Packers. Well, that's true, but they didn't make the Super Bowl, so technically that doesn't apply to them. And yes, I know about the 18-0 New England Patriots, but they went 18-0, so technically they had 0 losses. So anyway, the Broncos would be in their 8th Super Bowl, tying the Pats, Cowboys, and Steelers at that time for the most Super Bowl appearances by one franchise. But the Pats would break that mark the next season, being in Super Bowl 51. It was huge. It was the third most watched program in American TV history with 111 million people. So anyway, they were discussing a lot of things. There was a Los Angeles bid, depending on a team relocating and, a stadium being there. So they voted for San Francisco instead of Miami. So anyway, it was the first time since 2003 that a Super Bowl would be held in California. So anyways, the back-to-back, both teams were number one. Carolina was 15-1. They shocked a lot of people. They were 14-0. Actually, the record for the fastest start by an NFC team. The record was 13-0 by the 2009 Saints and 2011 Packers, but the Panthers won their first 14 games. They may have lost game 15. But it didn't matter. They were 15-1. They had 10 Pro Bowlers. Now, of course, in this era, if your team goes to the finals, you have to be replaced in the Pro Bowl, but you still get a Pro Bowl selection. The Panthers' offense was huge, 500 points. Cam Newton was just amazing. He threw for over 3,800 yards and ran for 636 of his own, putting up 45 total touchdowns, 35 passing, 10 rushing, and 10 interceptions. Only 10 interceptions. Greg Olsen was a great tight end. Ted Ginn Jr. could catch the ball with Jericho Cotchery and Devin Funches coming out of nowhere. Jonathan Stewart came through after D'Angelo Williams was waived. Anyway, the Panthers had some good defense too. Jared Allen was picked up from the Vikings. Luke Kuechly was there. Kurt Coleman and Josh Norman looked pretty good. Anyway, the Broncos had some problems. They actually faltered in the divisional round 3 of the last 4 years. So the Broncos made a move. John Fox was released for Gary Kubiak, who would ironically be John Elway's former backup quarterback because Elway is president of the team. Anyway, Wade Phillips would become defensive coordinator. Anyway, the Broncos put up Peyton Manning's stuff. He did quite well. He did have a plantar fasciitis injury during the summer. And the funny thing is, even though the Broncos started 7-0, Manning threw the most interceptions. And he would be benched for Brock Osweiler after throwing too many interceptions. But in the final regular season game against San Diego, Osweiler was benched leading Manning's return, and it worked. And the Broncos won that key game to get home field advantage. His passer rating was 67.9, very low. 2,249 yards, 9 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. Definitely not Peyton Manning numbers. Demetrius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders could catch the ball with Owen Daniels. Vernon Davis also was a Broncos player. C.J. Anderson and Ronnie Hillman were a two-headed monster in the backfield. Their defense was the best in the league. Malik Jackson, Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, Brandon Marshall, not the receiver Brandon Marshall, Danny Trevian, Aqib Talib, and Chris Harris were pretty good. So in the playoffs, Carolina hosted Seattle and beat them nearly 31-24. The funny thing is, the Panthers then crushed the tar out of the Cardinals 49-15. So, man, can you imagine? The better team did not make the NFC Finals. Broncos narrowly beat Pittsburgh by 7 points. They had to score 11 points in the final 3 minutes. And then they took care of the New England Patriots. It was so close. The Pats had a chance for a 2-point convert at the end of the game to tie the game, but failed. Taking me off, obviously. So, anyway, it was just amazing. Peyton Manning got to the Super Bowl at age 39, the oldest quarterback to play. The second at the time, the second oldest at the time, John Elway, his boss, which is ironic enough. Anyway, so Manning and Newton set the record for largest age difference between opposing Super Bowl quarterbacks of 13 plus years. And in fact, this was the first Super Bowl to have a quarterback on both teams who were the number 1 pick in the draft. Manning was the number 1 pick in 98 and Cam Newton 2011. So anyway, this also was huge. Because with Ron Rivera as Carolina head coach actually playing for the Bears in Super Bowl 20 and Kubiak playing in a couple of Super Bowls in relief of John Elway for the Broncos, this was the first Super Bowl that both head coaches actually were in the big game. And all that. A lot of people hated the turf, but thank goodness for San Francisco, they knew what they were doing. So anyway, yeah, it was a lot of job and all that. The CBS would get the game with Jim Nantz and Phil Simms, the big boys, calling that one. So CBS would introduce pylon cameras and all that. Kind of annoying, but whatever. Anyway, so it was amazing what they could do and all that. So yeah, Canada CTV would have it. Pre-game, Lady Gaga sang the national anthem. There were traditions that 39 of the 43 previous Super Bowl MVPs were on the field. Bart Starr and Chuck Howley appeared via video. Harvey Martin passed away. And of course, Peyton Manning couldn't be on the field because guess what? He's playing in the game. So anyway, the halftime show Coldplay would do everything alongside Bruno Mars and Mark Ronson. So anyway, the first quarter started off with a 64-yard drive by Denver, which only led to 3 points by Brandon McManus. However, the Broncos would get their own back later as a terrible fumble by Carolina led to Malik Jackson getting the ball in the end zone, touchdown Denver 10-0. Didn't look good for the 15-1 Panthers. I didn't believe in the Broncos, not just because Carolina had the better record, but because, Peyton Manning, was just not that great. He was losing his touch, I thought. And, of course, partially because of bias, because guess who's ever been in the AFC title game? Yes, of course, Broncos, the Pats. Anyway, Carolina did score a touchdown to make it 10-7 on a Jonathan Stewart touchdown run. However, by the end of the second quarter, McManus kicked a field goal, 13-7. And then McManus kicked another field goal to make it 16-7 after 3 quarters. Time was running out for the Broncos. I hoped. But anyway, the Panthers got a field goal by Gano, 16-10. And then, unfortunately, near the end of the game, one of the dumbest moves that Cam Newton did was with, 5 minutes left. He fumbled the ball, and it was recovered by T.J. Ward of the Broncos. Now, the problem was that Newton attempted the recovery, but he hesitated. His hesitation earned him criticism and could have been something. All that. Unfortunately, the Broncos would seal the game on a touchdown by C.J. Anderson and a 2-point convert. Carolina sucked. They really sucked. They lost 24-10. And Cam Newton was criticized. Why was he named MVP? And almost every MVP in the regular season falters in the big game. There have been many examples of that. So, yeah, there were a lot of things. Denver was actually outgained in total yards and first downs, yet they still won the game because of their defense. In fact, their 194 offensive yards was the lowest by a winning team, beating out the mark of the Ravens, who did 244 yards in Super Bowl 35. The Bears had 7 sacks, with tied record set by the Bears in Super Bowl 20. And Peyton was sacked 5 times too, so 12 sacks. It was the highest combined number in history. It's amazing how Denver was 1 for 14 on third down, yet they still won the game. Manning and Newton's QB passer ratings were 112 combined, and the lowest aggregate ever. Manning, on top of being the oldest quarterback to play in the Super Bowl and to win the Super Bowl subsequently, became the first quarterback to win a Super Bowl starting for 2 teams, and the first to win 200 games, regular season and postseason combined, as a starter. Manning would retire, rightfully so. I mean, the guy wanted to finish out on a high. Anyway, after Denver won that title, John Elway got to raise the trophy as the general manager. And he basically raised it and said, "This one's for Pat." Because Pat Bolin, the owner, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I think he died a couple years later. But anyway, Bolin actually saluted Elway in that same fashion when the Broncos won in 98, saying, "This one's for John." And Denver got a sports championship, first time since the Colorado Rapids won the 2010 MLS Cup. The Panthers were rematched with the Broncos in week 1 of the 2016 season. It was the first time since the end of Super Bowl 4 that the 2 teams that played in the Super Bowl would then meet in week 1. The Broncos won the game thanks to Graham Gano's missed field goal. Both teams would struggle and didn't make it. In fact, it was the first time in 13 years that the defending AFC and NFC champions would miss the playoffs in the same season. And this is the last time the Broncos, Super Bowl 50 is the last time the Broncos have been in a postseason game, much less in a Super Bowl. So that's huge. Carolina would try to bounce back, but Cam Newton kept getting hurt, and then he went to the Patriots for a season, and, Carolina just hasn't gotten their rhythm back. Now there's Denver, so yeah, that's that. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond, I do.